Dr. Margaret Sullivan stopped mid-stride down the sterile corridor, her coffee cup trembling as screams erupted from Laboratory 7. The 70-pound German Shepherd wasn't supposed to be capable of this. 3 staff members down, blood pooling beneath the reinforced steel door. It wasn't therapy gone wrong. It was a war zone. Security alarms shrieked through the Riverside Animal Research Center as orderlies scrambled past her, their white coats stained crimson. Equipment crashed to the floor in thunderous cascades of metal and glass. Through the observation window, Maggie glimpsed her 6-year-old granddaughter Emma pressed against the far wall, silent tears streaming down her face. The same child who hadn't spoken a word since her father's funeral. The same child Maggie had brought here out of desperation, hoping this place could heal what 2 years of therapy couldn't touch. "Lock down the building, Doctor." Harrison Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos, his cold gray eyes never leaving the monitors. But Maggie saw what others missed. The dog wasn't attacking Emma. Thunder was protecting her. And somehow, impossibly, the most aggressive animal in the facility had gone completely still at the sound of her granddaughter's silent weeping. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Margaret Sullivan had believed the worst of her troubles were behind her. At 68, she'd survived Vietnam as an Army nurse, buried her husband after 43 years of marriage, and watched her only son Michael ship off to Afghanistan with the confident smile that all soldiers wear for their mothers. She'd even survived the knock on her door from the chaplain, the folded flag, and the empty promises that Michael had died serving his country. What she hadn't prepared for was raising a 6-year-old granddaughter who hadn't spoken a word since the funeral. Emma Rose Sullivan sat in the corner of Maggie's modest Phoenix apartment, surrounded by coloring books she never touched and toys that gathered dust. The child who once chattered endlessly about butterflies and birthday parties now communicated only through nods, headshakes, and haunting pencil drawings of soldiers with wings. 2 years of expensive therapy sessions had drained Maggie's savings without producing a single word from Emma's lips. The Riverside Animal Research Center had seemed like a godsend when Maggie saw their advertisement in the Veterans Newsletter. Volunteers needed for animal therapy programs, flexible hours, small stipend provided. What the ad hadn't mentioned was that most of the animals housed in the sprawling complex were former military working dogs, many as traumatized as the veterans they'd once served. Dr. Harrison Blackwood had welcomed Maggie personally during her orientation, his steel gray eyes assessing her with clinical precision. "We're particularly interested in your nursing background, Mrs. Sullivan. Many of our animals require specialized care." The way he'd emphasized specialized had made her skin crawl, but $15 an hour was $15 an hour, and Emma's therapy bills weren't going to pay themselves. The facility itself was a contradiction. Gleaming laboratories adjoining converted kennels, where the sound of barking mixed with the hum of sophisticated equipment. Most volunteers worked with the gentler animals, the golden retrievers and therapy horses that visited nursing homes and schools. But Maggie found herself assigned to the restricted wing, where the difficult cases were housed. Thunder had been the most difficult of all. The 4-year-old German Shepherd had arrived 3 months earlier, his file stamped with red warnings. Extreme aggression, do not approach, bite history. He'd been found wandering the Arizona desert, a half-melted military collar around his neck and scars crisscrossing his black and tan coat like a road map of violence. He was a specialized K9, Dr. Blackwood had explained during Maggie's first day. Military breeding, extensive training. Unfortunately, whatever happened overseas left him damaged beyond repair. We're studying his brain patterns to better understand combat trauma in working animals. The way Blackwood spoke about Thunder, like a broken machine rather than a living creature, reminded Maggie uncomfortably of how some doctors had discussed her son's death. Clinical, detached, as if trauma were simply data to be collected rather than lives to be mourned. But financial desperation made strange bedfellows, and Maggie needed this job. Emma needed those therapy sessions, even if they weren't working. What Maggie didn't know was that some miracles came disguised as disasters, and sometimes the most broken souls were exactly what each other needed. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning when Maggie's regular babysitter called in sick with the flu. Emma had been scheduled for another expensive therapy session that afternoon, $150 that Maggie couldn't afford to lose, but she couldn't leave her granddaughter alone. The solution seemed simple enough: bring Emma to the research center for a few hours. Children weren't technically allowed in the facility, but Dr. Blackwood had mentioned that exceptions could be made for special circumstances. "She'll be perfectly safe in the volunteer break room," Maggie assured herself as she packed Emma's coloring books and juice boxes. "Just for a few hours until I can arrange something else." The Riverside Animal Research Center buzzed with its usual morning activity when they arrived. Researchers in white coats moved purposefully through the corridors, while the distant sounds of barking and medical equipment created a sterile symphony. Maggie settled Emma in the small break room with strict instructions to stay put, promising to check on her every 30 minutes. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to plan. Emma sat quietly at the plastic table, methodically coloring what appeared to be another drawing of soldiers, her small fingers gripping the crayon with the intensity she brought to everything since Michael's death. Maggie completed her morning routine of feeding the gentler animals and updating their medical charts, checking the wall clock religiously. It was during her second check that Maggie's world tilted off its axis. The break room was empty. Emma's coloring book lay open on the table, a half-finished drawing of a large dog wearing what looked like a military vest, abandoned mid-stroke. The crayon had rolled to the floor, its waxy point broken. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs as she searched under the table, behind the vending machine, in the small adjoining bathroom. Nothing. "Has anyone seen a little girl?" Maggie's voice cracked as she burst into the main corridor. 6 years old, dark hair, wearing a pink sweater. The staff members exchanged confused glances. Children weren't supposed to be in the facility. Security protocols strictly prohibited it. Dr. Blackwood appeared from his office, his expression shifting from mild irritation to sharp concern as Maggie explained the situation. "We need to implement lockdown procedures immediately," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to crisis management. "Check every room, every closet, every possible hiding place, and someone pull up the security footage." The search began systematically. Volunteer coordinators checked the office spaces while maintenance workers scoured storage areas. Maggie found herself moving through the facility with growing desperation, calling Emma's name in increasingly strained tones. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The rational part of her mind knew that Emma couldn't have gone far. The building was secured, all exits monitored, but the grandmother in her was spiraling toward panic. It was Dr. Jennifer Hayes, a young veterinary resident who finally called out from the restricted wing. "Dr. Sullivan, you need to see this!" Maggie ran toward the voice, her sensible shoes slapping against the polished floor. The restricted wing housed the facility's most challenging cases, the animals too dangerous or traumatized for regular volunteer interaction. High-security kennels lined both sides of the corridor, each equipped with reinforced doors and observation windows, and there, sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor directly in front of Thunder's enclosure, was Emma. The sight that greeted Maggie defied everything she knew about both her granddaughter and the facility's most aggressive animal. Emma sat perfectly still, her back straight, facing the massive German shepherd through the chain-link barrier. In her small hands, she held up a drawing, not the unfinished soldier from the break room, but something new. Even from a distance, Maggie could see it was a picture of a dog, carefully rendered in colored pencil with remarkable detail for a 6-year-old's work. But what stopped Maggie's breath entirely was Thunder's response. The German Shepherd that had sent 3 staff members to the emergency room sat motionless, his amber eyes fixed on Emma with an intensity that seemed almost human. His ears were forward, alert, but not aggressive. His massive frame was relaxed, settled into a position that suggested he'd been sitting there for some time. There was no growling, no pacing, none of the agitated behaviors that characterized his interactions with adults. "How long has she been here?" Maggie whispered to Dr. Hayes. "We're not sure. The security guard noticed her about 10 minutes ago, but she could have been here longer. Nobody heard any commotion, which is impossible with Thunder unless—" She trailed off, staring at the unprecedented scene before them. Dr. Blackwood materialized beside them, his gray eyes moving between Emma and Thunder with an expression Maggie couldn't quite read. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of scientific fascination that made her skin crawl. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Absolutely remarkable." The weeks that followed Emma's first encounter with Thunder transformed the sterile research facility into something resembling a small miracle. What had begun as a crisis had evolved into the most unprecedented case Dr. Blackwood claimed to have witnessed in his 20-year career. Every morning Maggie would bring Emma to work, and without fail, the child would gravitate toward Thunder's enclosure like a compass needle finding true north. The change in both child and animal was undeniable. Emma, who had spent 2 years locked in impenetrable silence, began showing subtle signs of engagement. She would sit for hours sketching Thunder in remarkable detail, her drawings evolving from simple outlines to complex portraits that captured the intelligence in the German Shepherd's amber eyes. More importantly, she had started making small sounds, not words yet, but soft humming while she drew, tiny gasps of delight when Thunder responded to her presence. Thunder's transformation was equally dramatic. The dog that had required 3 orderlies and a tranquilizer gun for basic medical procedures now allowed Emma to sit mere inches from his enclosure. His aggressive pacing had ceased entirely during her visits, replaced by an alert but calm watchfulness that reminded Maggie painfully of her son Michael's protective instincts. Dr. Blackwood documented everything with the fervor of a man witnessing scientific history. He installed additional cameras, brought in specialists from the university, and submitted detailed reports to what he called his funding partners. His interest in Emma's progress seemed genuine, almost fatherly, which made Maggie's growing unease all the more confusing. The first red flag came during Emma's 3rd week at the facility. Maggie had left her granddaughter with Thunder as usual while she completed her morning rounds in the rehabilitation wing. When she returned an hour later, she found Dr. Blackwood crouched beside Emma, speaking to her in low, measured tones, while a technician positioned what looked like a portable EEG machine nearby. "Just monitoring her brain activity during the interaction," Blackwood explained when Maggie questioned the equipment. "Purely observational research. Emma's connection with Thunder could revolutionize our understanding of trauma recovery in both humans and animals." Something about his phrasing, the clinical distance, the way he spoke about Emma as if she were another research subject, made Maggie's nursing instincts flare. "You should have asked my permission first." "Of course. My apologies." Blackwood's smile was practiced, professional. "I was so excited by the potential breakthrough that I got ahead of myself. But surely you understand the importance of documenting this. Emma's progress could help countless other children." The conversation might have ended there, but as Maggie helped pack up the monitoring equipment, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Emma's latest drawing lay on the floor beside Thunder's enclosure, not her usual careful portrait of the dog, but something that looked like a floor plan. Rooms connected by hallways with small figures drawn inside various spaces, and in one corner, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, Emma had drawn what appeared to be underground levels with tiny stick figures behind bars. Maggie folded the paper quickly, slipping it into her purse before anyone else could see it. Children drew strange things all the time, she told herself. It didn't necessarily mean anything. But that night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Maggie studied the drawing under her kitchen lamp and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arizona evening. The layout matched the research facility perfectly. Every corridor, every room Emma had access to during their visits. But those underground levels. Maggie had never seen a basement in the building. According to the facility tour she'd received during orientation, the complex was built on a single level due to the desert bedrock. Her unease deepened when she began paying closer attention to the facility's operations. She noticed that certain corridors were restricted, accessible only with special keycards. She observed how conversations stopped when she approached certain groups of researchers. Most troubling of all, she started recognizing a pattern in Dr. Blackwood's questions about Emma's background. "Has she always been nonverbal?" he'd asked during one of their casual conversations. "Any family history of developmental delays? Autism spectrum behaviors?" When Maggie explained that Emma's silence had begun after witnessing her father's military funeral, the 21-gun salute, the folded flag, the overwhelming finality of it all, Blackwood's interest sharpened visibly. "Trauma-induced selective mutism," he'd murmured, making notes. "And you said her father was military? Any history of PTSD in the family line?" The questions felt invasive, but Maggie answered them anyway. She needed this job, and Emma's therapy sessions cost more than her monthly Social Security check. Besides, if Dr. Blackwood's research could genuinely help other children, wasn't that worth some discomfort? But the breaking point came during Emma's 4th week at the facility. Maggie had finished her morning duties early and decided to check on Emma ahead of schedule. As she approached Thunder's enclosure, she heard voices. Dr. Blackwood speaking to someone on his phone, his tone urgent and excited. "The response patterns are extraordinary," he was saying. "Both subjects show synchronized behavioral modifications that suggest deep neurological adaptation. If we can isolate the mechanisms—" He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. "Yes, I understand the timeline pressures. The military contracts won't wait forever." Military contracts. The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear more. "The child's particular form of trauma makes her an ideal candidate for the enhanced protocols," Blackwood continued, "and the animal's combat background provides the perfect control variable. We should be ready to proceed to the next phase within the month." Enhanced protocols. Next phase. Control variable. The clinical language made Emma sound like a lab rat, and Thunder like nothing more than equipment to be tested. Maggie's hands shook as she crept closer to Emma, who sat peacefully beside Thunder's enclosure, both of them unaware that they had become unwitting participants in something far more sinister than animal therapy research. That night, Maggie sat at her kitchen table long after Emma had gone to bed, staring at her granddaughter's drawings spread across the worn Formica surface. Under the harsh fluorescent light, the innocent sketches took on a more sinister quality. The floor plans were too detailed, too accurate for a 6-year-old who had only visited the facility's main corridors. The underground levels Emma had drawn showed rooms filled with small figures that could have been children, could have been animals, or could have been something worse. Her laptop, a second-hand Dell that Michael had bought her before his deployment, hummed to life as Maggie began her research. The Riverside Animal Research Center's website painted a picture of cutting-edge veterinary care and breakthrough treatments for traumatized animals. Dr. Harrison Blackwood's biography was impressive. Johns Hopkins medical degree, specialization in neurological trauma, 20 years of government-funded research. But it was what the website didn't say that troubled Maggie most. No mention of the military contracts Blackwood had referenced. No details about the enhanced protocols he'd discussed so enthusiastically. And most disturbing of all, no information about where their funding actually came from, beyond vague references to private donors and federal research grants. Maggie's nursing background had taught her to recognize the difference between legitimate medical research and something more questionable. During her time at Walter Reed, she'd seen enough classified projects to know that the most dangerous experiments were often disguised as the most benevolent. The way Blackwood spoke about Emma, clinical, detached, excited by her potential, reminded her uncomfortably of researchers who saw patients as data points rather than human beings. Her investigation took on new urgency the next morning when she discovered Emma standing in the bathroom, staring at her reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. It was the longest her granddaughter had looked at herself since Michael's funeral, and what Maggie saw in the child's face made her heart clench. Emma's eyes, the same distinctive green that had always marked the Sullivan family, seemed to be studying something specific about her own features. "What is it, sweetheart?" Maggie asked softly, kneeling beside her granddaughter. Emma pointed at her reflection, then at a photograph tucked into the mirror's frame. One of the few pictures Maggie kept of her late son in his army dress uniform. For the first time in 2 years, Emma's lips moved as if she were trying to form words, but no sound emerged. The drive to the research facility that morning felt different, charged with an undercurrent of dread that Maggie couldn't shake. Her unease deepened when she noticed a black sedan with government plates parked in the visitors section, unusual for a facility that supposedly focused on animal welfare. Through the tinted windows, she could make out the silhouettes of 2 men in dark suits, the kind of federal agents who appeared when research crossed into territory the government wanted to monitor. Inside the facility, the morning routine proceeded as usual, but Maggie found herself paying attention to details she'd previously overlooked. The way certain staff members avoided eye contact, the locked doors that required special clearance, the subtle but persistent hum of ventilation systems that suggested the building extended deeper underground than the single level she'd been shown. Her suspicions crystallized during lunch break when she overheard a conversation between 2 research assistants in the break room. They were discussing Subject 7 and Subject 12 with the same clinical detachment Blackwood used when talking about Emma and Thunder. When one mentioned the basement protocols and enhanced behavioral modification, Maggie felt her blood turn to ice. The afternoon brought a development that changed everything. Dr. Blackwood appeared in the volunteer area with a broad smile, and what he clearly considered wonderful news. "Mrs. Sullivan, I have a proposition that I think will interest you greatly," he began, his gray eyes bright with excitement. "Emma's progress with Thunder has been so remarkable that we'd like to formalize her participation in our research program. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation, enough to cover all of her therapy expenses and then some." Maggie's throat tightened. "What kind of participation?" "Nothing invasive, I assure you. Simply extended observation sessions, perhaps some controlled interaction studies. We believe Emma's unique connection with Thunder could unlock breakthrough treatments for childhood trauma." Blackwood paused, his expression growing more serious. "The compensation would be $50,000, Mrs. Sullivan, enough to secure Emma's therapeutic future." $50,000. The number hit Maggie like a physical blow. It was more money than she'd seen since Michael's life insurance payout, enough to transform Emma's prospects entirely. But the way Blackwood presented it, like a business transaction rather than a medical opportunity, set off every alarm bell her nursing experience had installed. "I need time to think about it," she managed. "Of course. But Mrs. Sullivan?" Blackwood's smile took on a harder edge. "Opportunities like this don't come along often. Emma is special, more special than you might realize. We're offering her a chance to help not just herself but countless other children. I hope you won't let misplaced caution prevent her from reaching her full potential." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Maggie spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of barely controlled panic, watching Emma sit peacefully beside Thunder's enclosure while her mind raced through possibilities. She needed that money desperately, but every instinct screamed that accepting Blackwood's offer would be signing Emma up for something far more dangerous than therapy sessions. Her worst fears were confirmed when she stayed late that evening, using her volunteer key card to access areas of the facility she'd never explored. The building seemed different after hours, quieter, but with an underlying tension that made her skin crawl. Following the layout from Emma's drawings, she discovered a service elevator hidden behind a maintenance door, its controls requiring a special access card she didn't possess. But the freight elevator nearby was less secure, and Maggie's experience navigating hospital bureaucracy had taught her that maintenance areas were often overlooked by security protocols. The elevator descended further than she'd expected, opening onto a corridor that looked nothing like the cheerful veterinary facility upstairs. The basement level was institutional in the worst sense: concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, and the unmistakable smell of fear that Maggie recognized from psychiatric wards. Through reinforced glass windows, she could see a dozen or more animals in isolation chambers that were far more sophisticated than simple kennels. Monitoring equipment lined the walls, recording everything from heart rates to brain activity patterns. But it was the final room that made her knees buckle. Through a partially open door, Maggie glimpsed a space that looked like a combination surgical suite and behavioral laboratory. Restraint systems designed for both animals and humans. Monitoring equipment that belonged in a research hospital, not an animal shelter. And on the wall, a planning board covered with photographs and charts that made her stomach lurch. Emma's picture was there, along with detailed medical histories and behavioral assessments. Thunder's information occupied an adjacent section, but he wasn't alone. Photographs of at least a dozen other children were pinned beside images of various animals, connected by lines and notations that suggested some kind of systematic pairing process. At the center of it all was a document that bore the seal of the Department of Defense and a title that made Maggie's blood freeze: Project Mirror, Enhanced Trauma Recovery, through Controlled Animal-Human Neurological Synchronization. The implications hit her like a sledgehammer. This wasn't animal therapy research. This was something far more sinister, an attempt to weaponize the natural bonds between traumatized children and animals, to create some kind of enhanced psychological conditioning that could be controlled and replicated. Emma wasn't being healed. She was being recruited. Maggie's hands shook as she used her phone to photograph the documents, her nursing training overriding her panic enough to focus on gathering evidence. But as she prepared to leave, a sound from the corridor made her freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets, approaching with purpose. She barely made it to the freight elevator before voices echoed through the basement level. As the elevator rose toward the main floor, she heard Dr. Blackwood's voice carrying clearly through the concrete shaft. The Sullivan child is ready for the next phase. Her grandmother's resistance is expected, but we have leverage. The financial pressure, the custody threats, she'll cooperate. Custody threats. The words echoed in Maggie's mind as she stumbled toward the parking lot. Blackwood wasn't just researching Emma's connection with Thunder. He was planning to separate them permanently, to use whatever legal means necessary to gain control over her granddaughter. The drive home passed in a blur of panic and desperate planning. Maggie's mind raced through options, each more impossible than the last. She could go to the police, but what evidence did she have beyond a few photographs and her own suspicions? She could run, but where would a 68-year-old woman go with a traumatized child and no resources? But as she pulled into her driveway and saw Emma's bedroom window glowing with the soft light of her night lamp, Maggie felt something harder than panic settle in her chest. This was her granddaughter, Michael's child, the last piece of her son she had left in the world. The emergency confrontation came sooner than Maggie had anticipated. She'd barely slept after discovering the basement laboratory, spending the pre-dawn hours alternately pacing her living room and checking on Emma, who slept peacefully, unaware that her entire world was about to explode. Maggie had decided to keep Emma home from the facility while she figured out her next move, but Dr. Blackwood had other plans. The knock on her door came at precisely 8 o'clock, the same time Emma would normally be settling in beside Thunder's enclosure. Through the peephole, Maggie saw Blackwood flanked by two men in expensive suits, not the government agents from yesterday, but lawyers, judging by their briefcases and predatory smiles. "Mrs. Sullivan," Blackwood's voice carried through the door with forced warmth. "We need to discuss Emma's future. I think you'll find our conversation quite illuminating." Maggie's hands trembled as she opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Emma's not feeling well today. We won't be coming in." "Actually, Mrs. Sullivan, Emma's health is precisely what we need to discuss." One of the lawyers stepped forward, producing a thick manila folder. "I'm Richard Steinberg from Hartwell, Morrison and Associates. We represent the Riverside Research Foundation, and we have some concerns about Emma's current living situation." The words hit Maggie like ice water. She'd expected pressure, perhaps threats about the research program, but not this, not a direct challenge to her guardianship of Emma. "What kind of concerns?" she managed, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. Blackwood's mask of professional courtesy slipped slightly, revealing something colder underneath. "May we come in? This conversation would be better conducted privately." Against every instinct, Maggie released the chain and stepped back. Emma was in her bedroom, hopefully still asleep, and the last thing Maggie wanted was for her granddaughter to witness whatever was about to happen. The three men arranged themselves in her small living room like a tribunal. Steinberg opened his briefcase with the practiced efficiency of someone who destroyed lives for a living, while Blackwood studied family photographs on the mantelpiece with disturbing interest. "Mrs. Sullivan," Steinberg began, consulting his papers, "our investigation into Emma's care situation has revealed several concerning factors. You're a 68-year-old woman on a fixed income, providing primary care for a severely traumatized child with special needs. Emma hasn't spoken in over 2 years, hasn't received consistent professional treatment, and appears to be regressing rather than improving under your care." "That's not true," Maggie protested, but Steinberg continued relentlessly. "Furthermore, we have evidence that you've been exposing Emma to potentially dangerous situations, bringing her to a research facility without proper authorization, allowing her unsupervised contact with aggressive animals, and failing to provide the specialized therapeutic interventions her condition requires." The second lawyer, who'd remained silent until now, placed a new set of documents on Maggie's coffee table. "Dr. Blackwood has generously offered to provide Emma with comprehensive care through a specialized residential program designed specifically for children with her particular needs. The program would be completely funded, providing Emma with round-the-clock therapeutic support and access to treatments that are simply beyond your current resources." Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs as the implications became clear. They weren't just threatening to take Emma away, they were positioning it as a mercy, a rescue from an inadequate guardian who couldn't provide proper care. "Emma doesn't need residential treatment," Maggie said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "She needs stability, love, and time to heal from losing her father." Blackwood finally turned from the photographs, his gray eyes cold as surgical steel. "Mrs. Sullivan, with all due respect, your granddaughter's condition is far more complex than simple grief. Our preliminary assessments suggest she may be on the autism spectrum, possibly with additional neurological complications that require immediate intervention. Every day we delay proper treatment is a day Emma loses in her potential recovery." The lie was delivered so smoothly, with such professional authority, that for a moment Maggie almost doubted her own memory. But she'd lived with Emma for 2 years, had watched her granddaughter's bright intelligence shine through even in her silence. Emma wasn't autistic. She was heartbroken. "I want you to leave," Maggie said quietly. Steinberg smiled, the predatory grin of a shark scenting blood. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, Mrs. Sullivan. We have a court order for a wellness check and psychological evaluation. Emma's biological father has petitioned for emergency custody based on concerns about her current living situation." The words didn't make sense at first. Emma's biological father had been out of the picture since before her birth, a brief relationship that ended when he learned about the pregnancy. Michael had adopted Emma when she was 18 months old, becoming the only father she'd ever known. But as understanding dawned, Maggie felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She looked at Blackwood, really looked at him, and saw the features she'd been unconsciously recognizing for weeks, the distinctive green eyes that Emma had inherited, the shape of his jaw, the way he carried himself with unconscious arrogance. "You," she breathed, "you're Emma's biological father." Blackwood's smile was arctic. "I am, and I've spent the last 6 years building a career and establishing the resources necessary to provide Emma with the life she deserves, a life that includes proper medical care, educational opportunities, and therapeutic interventions that can unlock her full potential." The room spun around Maggie as the full scope of the trap became clear. This hadn't been a coincidence. Emma's connection with Thunder, Blackwood's interest in their case, the research program that seemed too good to be true. He'd been watching them, manipulating events, positioning himself to swoop in as Emma's savior while painting Maggie as an inadequate guardian. "Emma doesn't even know you exist," Maggie said desperately. "You can't just appear after 6 years and claim parental rights." "Actually, I can," Steinberg interjected smoothly. "Mr. Blackwood's paternal rights were never legally terminated. He was young when Emma was born, focused on his education and career, but he never stopped caring about his daughter's welfare. Recent events have convinced him that Emma needs more specialized care than you can provide." The third man, who'd been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Mrs. Sullivan, we're not trying to hurt Emma or take away your relationship with her. Dr. Blackwood's residential program would allow for supervised visitation, and Emma would receive the best possible care while maintaining family connections. Supervised visitation. The phrase hit Maggie like a slap. They were offering to let her visit her own granddaughter like a distant relative, while Blackwood took control of Emma's life and turned her into a research subject. "What's really in that basement, Dr. Blackwood?" Maggie asked quietly. "What are you planning to do with those children?" For just a moment, Blackwood's composure cracked, revealing something that made Maggie's blood freeze. Not just ambition or scientific curiosity, but a kind of obsessive need that had nothing to do with Emma's welfare, and everything to do with his own twisted vision of perfection. "I'm planning to give them a future, Mrs. Sullivan. Something you clearly cannot provide." The sound of footsteps on the hallway stairs interrupted the tense standoff. Emma appeared in the living room doorway, still in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her gaze moved from Maggie to the 3 strangers, and something in her posture changed, a subtle stiffening that reminded Maggie painfully of Thunder's reaction to perceived threats. Emma's eyes found Blackwood and stayed there, studying his face with the intense focus she usually reserved for her drawings. For a moment, recognition flickered across her features. Not memory, but something deeper, an ancestral understanding of shared genetics. Then Emma did something that surprised everyone in the room. She walked directly to Maggie, climbed into her lap, and buried her face against her grandmother's shoulder. It was the most physical affection she'd shown since Michael's funeral, and the message was unmistakable. This was where she felt safe. "Hello, Emma," Blackwood said softly, his voice taking on a tone Maggie had never heard before, almost gentle, but with an undercurrent of possessive satisfaction. "I'm a friend of your grandmother's. We've been talking about you." Emma's grip on Maggie tightened and she turned her head just enough to look at Blackwood again. When she opened her mouth, Maggie expected nothing. Emma hadn't spoken in 2 years, despite countless therapy sessions and desperate encouragement. But what emerged was a single word, whispered so quietly that Maggie almost missed it. Thunder. The word hung in the air like a prayer or a warning. Emma wasn't just speaking, she was making a connection, recognizing that this man represented a threat to the one relationship that had begun to heal her broken spirit. Blackwood's eyes lit up with scientific fascination and paternal pride in equal measure. "She spoke," he said wonderingly. "Emma, do you know who I am?" But Emma had already retreated back into silence, pressing closer to Maggie as if she could disappear entirely into her grandmother's protective embrace. The lawyers exchanged glances, and Steinberg checked his watch with bureaucratic precision. "Mrs. Sullivan, the court order allows us to conduct our evaluation today. Emma needs to come with us for a comprehensive psychological assessment." "No." The word came out stronger than Maggie had expected, powered by 2 years of accumulated grief and love and desperate determination. "You're not taking her anywhere." Blackwood stood slowly, his professional mask slipping back into place. "Mrs. Sullivan, you're only making this harder on Emma. The evaluation is mandatory, and resistance will only be noted in our report as evidence of your unwillingness to cooperate with Emma's therapeutic needs." But as he spoke, Maggie noticed something that gave her a fragment of hope. Emma had lifted her head and was looking toward the window, toward the parking lot where Maggie could see a familiar van. The mobile veterinary unit that Dr. Sarah Chen used for her house calls was pulling up outside, and through the window, Maggie could see movement in the back of the vehicle. Emma saw it too, and for the first time in months, something like excitement flickered across her face. Thunder was here. The chaos that erupted in Maggie's living room defied everything the lawyers had carefully orchestrated. What none of them had anticipated was Dr. Sarah Chen's decision to bring Thunder along for what she'd believed would be a routine wellness check on Emma. The mobile veterinary unit outside wasn't part of any official plan. It was simply the compassionate action of a veterinarian who'd noticed how Emma and Thunder had bonded at the facility. But Thunder's presence changed everything. The moment the German Shepherd caught Emma's scent through the apartment's thin walls, his protective instincts overrode every behavioral conditioning the research facility had attempted. The sound that emerged from the van wasn't the controlled response of a research subject. It was the primal howl of a warrior recognizing that his charge was in danger. Emma bolted upright in Maggie's lap, her eyes wide with recognition and something that looked like relief. For the first time since the lawyers had arrived, she seemed fully present, fully aware of her surroundings. The connection between child and animal transcended the physical barriers separating them, creating a moment of pure communication that left everyone in the room stunned. "That's impossible," Blackwood breathed, moving toward the window. "Thunder shouldn't be here. He's scheduled for behavioral modification procedures this afternoon." The admission slipped out before he could stop it, revealing more than he'd intended about the facility's true operations. Behavioral modification procedures weren't standard veterinary care. They were the kind of invasive interventions used to break an animal's will, to reshape their responses according to human design. Steinberg tried to regain control of the situation. "Mrs. Sullivan, we need to proceed with the evaluation. The presence of an aggressive animal only reinforces our concerns about Emma's safety in your care." But Emma had other plans. She slipped from Maggie's lap with liquid grace and moved toward the apartment door, her small hands working the locks with surprising competence. Before anyone could stop her, she was outside, running across the parking lot toward the veterinary van, where Thunder's howls had escalated to desperate intensity. "Emma, no!" Blackwood shouted, his professional composure finally cracking entirely. He lunged toward the door, but Maggie moved faster than her 68 years should have allowed, placing herself between him and the exit. "You're not touching her," she said quietly, but with a steel in her voice that came from decades of facing down hostile patients, incompetent doctors, and military bureaucrats who thought they knew better than the nurses actually providing care. Outside, Emma had reached the van where Dr. Chen was struggling to maintain control of Thunder. The German Shepherd's agitation had reached levels that concerned even his veterinarian, but the moment Emma appeared, his behavior changed dramatically. The frantic howling stopped, replaced by soft whines of recognition and relief. "Emma, honey, you need to step back," Dr. Chen called, but she was already opening the van's rear doors. Her professional instincts told her to maintain separation between the child and the agitated animal, but something about their connection suggested that separation might be causing more distress than contact. Thunder bounded from the van and immediately positioned himself between Emma and the apartment building, his massive frame creating a protective barrier. But there was no aggression in his stance, only alertness, the kind of focused attention a guardian shows when protecting something precious. Emma knelt beside Thunder, her small hands finding the spots behind his ears that calmed him most effectively. For the first time in 2 years, she began to speak, not the single words that had shocked everyone before, but a steady stream of soft reassurances directed at the dog. "It's okay, boy. I know you're scared. They want to hurt us, don't they? But we're together now. We're safe together." The words carried across the parking lot with crystalline clarity, reaching Maggie through the open apartment door like a miracle. Emma wasn't just speaking. She was communicating with the emotional intelligence of someone far older than her 6 years, recognizing Thunder's fear and responding with compassion. Inside the apartment, Blackwood had gone very still, his scientific mind processing the implications of what he was witnessing. This wasn't the traumatized, potentially autistic child he'd described to the courts. This was a little girl demonstrating sophisticated emotional regulation and interspecies communication that contradicted every assessment his team had compiled. "Remarkable," he murmured, but the wonder in his voice carried an undercurrent of possessive hunger that made Maggie's skin crawl. "She's even more extraordinary than we theorized." Steinberg was frantically making phone calls, summoning additional support to manage a situation that had spiraled far beyond their careful legal maneuvering. The second lawyer had produced a tablet and was documenting everything, building a new case file in real time. But their careful plans unraveled further when additional vehicles began arriving. Dr. Chen's emergency call had triggered responses from multiple agencies: Animal Control, Child Protective Services, and most significantly, a news van from the local television station that had been monitoring police scanners for interesting stories. The presence of media transformed the entire dynamic. What Blackwood and his lawyers had intended as a quiet custody transfer was becoming a public spectacle, with reporters capturing footage of Emma speaking clearly and calmly to Thunder, while official-looking men in suits argued in the background. "Dr. Blackwood," a reporter called out, recognizing him from previous interviews about the research facility. "Can you comment on the situation here? Is this related to your work at Riverside?" Blackwood's face went ashen as he realized the implications. His carefully constructed public image as a compassionate researcher was about to collide with the reality of what he'd been planning for Emma. Media attention was the last thing he needed, especially with his underground laboratory full of questionable research protocols. But the real turning point came when Thunder suddenly tensed, his attention shifting from protective mode to something more focused and dangerous. Through the crowd of officials and reporters, a familiar figure was approaching, one of the security guards from the research facility, moving with purposeful intent toward Emma. Thunder's response was immediate and unmistakable. The gentle companion who'd been comforting Emma transformed into something primal and fierce, his protective instincts overriding every other consideration. But instead of attacking, he did something that surprised everyone present. Thunder began to herd Emma away from the approaching threat, using his body to guide her toward Dr. Chen's van while positioning himself as a living barrier. His movements were precise, controlled, clearly the result of sophisticated training that had nothing to do with pet obedience and everything to do with protection protocols. Military training, Dr. Chen observed quietly, recognizing the patterns. This dog has combat experience. The revelation added another layer to the unfolding drama. Thunder wasn't just a research subject or therapy animal. He was a veteran, possibly with his own history of service and sacrifice. The idea that Blackwood had been conducting behavioral modification procedures on a military working dog added a disturbing dimension to the ethical questions surrounding the facility. Emma seemed to understand the gravity of the situation despite her young age. As Thunder guided her toward safety, she turned back toward the apartment building where Maggie stood in the doorway, surrounded by lawyers and officials who suddenly seemed less intimidating in the harsh light of public scrutiny. "Grandma Maggie?" Emma called out, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "Thunder says we have to go now. He says the bad men want to hurt us, but he won't let them." The simple statement, delivered with absolute trust in both her grandmother and her four-legged protector, crystallized everything that was wrong with Blackwood's plans. Emma wasn't a damaged child in need of fixing. She was a little girl who'd found healing through love and connection, exactly as Maggie had always believed. But even as hope flickered in Maggie's chest, she could see Blackwood's expression hardening with determination. He'd invested too much in this project, built too much of his professional reputation on the research Emma represented. The presence of media and officials hadn't deterred him. It had simply forced him to accelerate his timeline. The security guard had reached the van, and despite Thunder's protective stance, he was producing what looked like a tranquilizer gun. The situation was about to escalate from a custody dispute to something far more dangerous, and Emma stood at the center of it all, finally speaking again, but possibly about to lose everything that had helped her find her voice. The battle for Emma's future was entering its most dangerous phase, and Thunder was the only thing standing between her and the people who saw her as a research opportunity rather than a little girl who just wanted to go home with her grandmother. The tranquilizer dart meant for Thunder struck the side of Dr. Chen's van instead, embedding itself in the metal with a sharp ping that seemed to freeze time itself. Emma's scream pierced the morning air. Not the silent suffering she'd endured for 2 years, but a full-throated cry of terror and rage that galvanized everyone present. Thunder's response was immediate and devastating. The German Shepherd launched himself at the security guard with the precision of his military training, but instead of attacking, he executed a perfect takedown that left the man sprawled on the asphalt with his weapon scattered beyond reach. The move was textbook tactical, designed to neutralize threats without causing permanent harm, the kind of sophisticated combat training that took years to develop. "Jesus Christ," one of the reporters breathed, his camera capturing every moment. "That dog's been to war." The revelation rippled through the crowd like wildfire. This wasn't just an aggressive shelter animal, this was a veteran, possibly with his own service record and heroic history. The optics of sedating a military working dog to force him away from a traumatized child were catastrophic for Blackwood's carefully constructed narrative. Emma ran to Thunder's side, her small arms wrapping around his neck as he stood protectively over the fallen guard. "Don't hurt him," she pleaded, looking directly at the news cameras with tears streaming down her face. "Thunder saved me. He's my best friend. Please don't let them take him away." The raw emotion in her voice, the clarity of her speech after 2 years of silence, created a moment of pure television gold that would be replaying on news stations within the hour. But more than that, it crystallized the moral stakes of the situation in terms that even legal maneuvering couldn't obscure. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her veterinary authority giving her voice weight in the chaos. "That tranquilizer dart contained enough sedative to drop a horse," she announced, loudly enough for the cameras to catch. "If it had hit Emma, it could have killed her." The statement sent shockwaves through the assembled officials. Child Protective Services representatives began backing away from Blackwood's team, while the animal control officers found themselves in the awkward position of having to protect rather than restrain Thunder. Blackwood himself had gone very pale, recognizing that his carefully orchestrated plan was collapsing in the most public way possible. The security guard's use of a tranquilizer weapon on a civilian property, in front of news cameras while a child was present, had crossed lines that even his legal team couldn't uncross. "This is a misunderstanding," he called out to the reporters, his voice strained. "The animal is dangerous, unpredictable. We were simply trying to ensure everyone's safety." But Emma's response cut through his explanations like a blade. Standing beside Thunder, no longer the silent, traumatized child Blackwood had described in court documents, she looked directly into the cameras with her distinctive green eyes, eyes that bore an unmistakable resemblance to Blackwood's own. "He's lying," she said simply. "Thunder isn't dangerous. The doctor wants to hurt us because he's my daddy, but he's not a good daddy. He wants to put machines in my head to make me different." The bombshell revelation sent the media into a frenzy. Cameras swung toward Blackwood, capturing his stunned expression as his biological relationship to Emma became public knowledge. The story had just transformed from a custody dispute to something far more sinister, a father using his professional position to gain control over a daughter he'd abandoned. Maggie seized the moment, pushing through the crowd of officials to reach Emma's side. As she knelt beside her granddaughter and Thunder, the three of them formed a tableau that perfectly encapsulated the real relationships at stake. Not the clinical assessments and legal maneuverings, but the bonds of love and protection that had sustained them through their darkest times. "Emma's been healing," Maggie said, her voice carrying clearly to the cameras. "Not because of any research program, but because she found something to love and protect. Thunder didn't make her better. Loving Thunder made her better." The statement was simple but profound, cutting through the complex psychological theories and treatment protocols to the fundamental truth that Blackwood's obsession with measurement and modification had missed entirely. But even as the media narrative shifted in their favor, Maggie could see that Blackwood wasn't finished. His professional reputation was in ruins, his research program exposed, but the possessive gleam in his eyes suggested that losing Emma publicly might drive him to even more desperate measures. The security guard was struggling to his feet, blood seeping from a head wound where he'd struck the pavement. 2 more vehicles with government plates were approaching, and Maggie recognized the purposeful movements of federal agents who wouldn't be deterred by media attention or public sympathy. "We need to go," Dr. Chen said quietly, recognizing the same threat. "My van, now. I can get you away from here." But Thunder had other ideas. The German Shepherd moved away from Emma, positioning himself between the approaching vehicles and the people he'd chosen to protect. His stance was alert but not aggressive, the posture of a sentinel rather than an attacker. Emma seemed to understand what Thunder was communicating. She looked up at Maggie with eyes that held far too much wisdom for a 6-year-old. Thunder says we have to stay and fight. He says running away means they win. The child's words carried the weight of hard-earned understanding. Emma had been running from her trauma for 2 years, hiding in silence from a world that seemed too dangerous to engage with. But Thunder had taught her that some things were worth standing up for, even when the odds seemed impossible. A new voice cut through the chaos, authoritative, familiar, and completely unexpected. "Stand down! Federal agents!" Agent Sarah Martinez of the FBI stepped out of one of the government vehicles, her badge held high and her expression grimly determined. Behind her came 3 more agents, moving with the coordinated precision of a team that had been planning this operation for some time. "Dr. Harrison Blackwood, you're under arrest for violations of the Federal Animal Welfare Act, fraudulent use of government research funds, and conspiracy to conduct unauthorized medical experiments on minors." The words hit like thunderclaps, revealing that the federal interest in Blackwood's facility had nothing to do with supporting his research and everything to do with investigating it. The agents who'd been watching the facility weren't there to protect his work. They were gathering evidence to prosecute him. Blackwood's face went through a range of emotions: shock, denial, and finally a kind of desperate rage that made Maggie instinctively pull Emma closer. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising to near hysteria. "The research is vital. These children, these animals, they're the key to understanding trauma recovery. Emma is special, more special than any of you realize." "What makes her special, Doctor?" "Blackwood," Agent Martinez replied coldly, "is that she's a 6-year-old child who deserves to grow up with people who love her, not researchers who see her as a test subject." The federal agents moved with efficient precision, separating Blackwood from his legal team and placing him in restraints, despite his continued protests about the importance of his research. The security guard was loaded into an ambulance, more for protective custody than medical treatment. But even as justice finally began to unfold, the most important moment came when Emma turned to Thunder and wrapped her arms around his neck one more time. "Thank you for saving me," she whispered, her words meant for him alone but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the parking lot. "Thank you for helping me find my voice again." Thunder's response was a gentle nuzzle against her cheek, the kind of affection that spoke to the deep bond they'd forged through mutual healing. He'd found his purpose again in protecting Emma, just as she'd found her courage again in caring for him. As the federal agents loaded Blackwood into their vehicle, he made one last desperate attempt to justify his actions. "She could have been extraordinary," he shouted toward Emma. "I could have unlocked abilities you can't even imagine." Emma looked at him with the clear-eyed assessment of someone far older than her years. "I don't want to be extraordinary for you," she said simply. "I just want to be Emma." The statement carried a weight that silenced even the reporters, a perfect encapsulation of the fundamental human right to be loved for who you are rather than modified into what someone else thinks you should become. Agent Martinez approached Maggie with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal warmth. "Mrs. Sullivan, we've been investigating Dr. Blackwood's operations for 8 months. Your granddaughter's safety was never in real danger. We had agents watching the facility around the clock." 8 months? Maggie's voice was hoarse with exhaustion and relief. Dr. Blackwood's research funding came with oversight requirements he thought he could circumvent. When we realized children were being recruited for his programs, we moved to gather evidence for prosecution. Emma's case gave us everything we needed. The revelation that federal protection had been in place all along should have been comforting, but Maggie found herself focusing on a different truth. Emma's healing hadn't come from surveillance or intervention. It had come from love, patience, and the simple recognition that some bonds transcend explanation. As the official vehicles departed and the media began packing up their equipment, a strange calm settled over the parking lot. Emma sat beside Thunder in the shade of Dr. Chen's van, quietly sketching in the notebook she'd carried everywhere for 2 years. But instead of the soldiers with wings that had filled her drawing since Michael's death, she was drawing something new. A little girl and a dog side by side, facing the world together. The battle was over, but the real work of healing was just beginning. 6 months after the federal agents led Dr. Harrison Blackwood away in handcuffs, Margaret Sullivan stood in the kitchen of her Phoenix apartment, watching through the window as Emma played in the small courtyard with Thunder. The transformation in both child and dog was nothing short of miraculous, but it had been hard-won through months of patient healing and the kind of love that doesn't make headlines, but changes everything. The legal proceedings had moved with surprising efficiency once the full scope of Blackwood's research program became public. Federal investigators had uncovered evidence of unauthorized experiments involving dozens of children and animals, research protocols that violated every ethical standard in both veterinary and psychological medicine. The Riverside Animal Research Center had been permanently shut down, its assets liquidated to provide compensation for the families who'd been deceived by Blackwood's promises of healing. Emma's voice had returned gradually, not all at once like in the movies, but in fits and starts that reflected the complex process of rebuilding trust with a world that had seemed too dangerous to engage. She spoke freely to Thunder, tentatively to Maggie, and with growing confidence to the gentle therapist they'd found, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, Agent Martinez's sister, who specialized in treating children who'd experienced medical trauma. The real breakthrough had come when Emma finally talked about the day her father died. Not the military funeral that everyone assumed had triggered her silence, but the moment 3 weeks earlier when she'd overheard Michael on the phone with Blackwood discussing his deployment and what would happen to Emma if he didn't come home. "Daddy was scared," Emma had explained to Dr. Martinez during one of their sessions, with Maggie present and Thunder lying peacefully at her feet. "He told the doctor that he was my real daddy, not the biological one, and that he never wanted that bad man to have me. But then Daddy died, and I thought maybe if I didn't talk, the bad man wouldn't know I was smart enough to remember." The revelation had explained so much. Why Emma's silence had been so complete. Why she'd seemed to retreat into herself rather than simply grieving. She hadn't been traumatized by loss alone, but by the specific fear that speaking might somehow alert Blackwood to her existence. Learning that Michael had been trying to protect her from Blackwood even before his deployment had been devastating for Maggie, but it had also provided a crucial piece of understanding. Michael had known about his biological father's work, had recognized the danger it represented, and had been trying to build legal protections that his death had left incomplete. The federal investigation had revealed the full scope of Michael's prescience. Blackwood had been monitoring military families for years, identifying children with specific psychological profiles that might make them suitable for his research. Emma's combination of high intelligence, trauma susceptibility, and biological connection to him had made her a perfect target, something Michael had somehow intuited despite never knowing the full details of Blackwood's program. The justice system had moved swiftly once the evidence became clear. Blackwood was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for child endangerment, animal cruelty, research fraud, and a dozen other charges. His medical license was permanently revoked, and his research was discredited by every major psychological and veterinary organization in the country. But for Maggie, the most satisfying outcome had been much simpler. The judge's ruling that terminated Blackwood's parental rights permanently and granted Maggie full legal guardianship of Emma. The man who'd abandoned his daughter as an infant and then tried to claim her as a research subject would never have any legal claim to her future. The financial settlement from the federal case had been substantial, enough to pay for Emma's therapy, secure their future, and even allow Maggie to pursue a dream she'd never thought possible. With Thunder as their inspiration, they'd established a small, non-profit organization called Michael's Haven, dedicated to matching traumatized children with animals who needed healing themselves. The program operated out of a modest facility on the outskirts of Phoenix, where children dealing with various forms of trauma could interact with rescue animals under careful supervision. Emma, now 7 and increasingly confident, had become their youngest volunteer, helping other children find the same kind of connection that had saved her. Thunder remained the program's star, but he was no longer the aggressive, unapproachable animal who'd terrorized the research facility. Working with children had given him purpose again, channeling his protective instincts into something positive. His military training, rather than being suppressed or modified, was celebrated and utilized, teaching him to recognize signs of distress, to provide comfort without overwhelming, to be a guardian rather than a weapon. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Emma still had nightmares sometimes, and Thunder still carried scars from whatever had happened to him overseas. But they'd learned to comfort each other through the difficult moments, creating a support system that transcended species and spoke to the fundamental power of unconditional love. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had documented their progress extensively, not for research purposes, but to help other therapists understand how healing could happen outside traditional medical models. Her reports emphasized that Emma's recovery hadn't come from medication or intensive interventions, but from safety, patience, and the simple recognition that some wounds could only be healed by connection. Children don't need to be fixed, Dr. Martinez had written in one of her papers about the case. They need to be loved, protected, and given time to rediscover their own strength. Emma Sullivan's journey back to speech wasn't a medical miracle, it was a human one. The media attention had been intense initially, but Maggie had been careful to protect Emma's privacy while still allowing their story to help other families facing similar challenges. The message they tried to convey was simple. Healing takes time. Love matters more than expertise, and sometimes the most broken souls are exactly what each other needs. On this particular morning, 6 months after the crisis that had nearly torn their family apart, Maggie was preparing for a special visitor. Agent Sarah Martinez had called the previous week to ask if she could stop by with someone who wanted to meet Emma, a veteran who'd heard about Thunder's story and thought it might help him understand his own struggles with PTSD. When the doorbell rang, Maggie opened it to find Agent Martinez accompanied by a man in his 30s wearing a Purple Heart pin on his jacket. He moved with the careful gait of someone managing chronic pain, and his eyes held the same haunted quality Maggie had recognized in Thunder when they'd first met. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Staff Sergeant David Chen, Dr. Chen's nephew." He served 2 tours in Afghanistan with a K-9 partner who was killed by an IED. He's been struggling with the transition to civilian life, and his aunt thought meeting Thunder might help. Emma appeared in the doorway, her natural shyness around new people balanced by curiosity about anyone connected to Thunder's world. "Are you a soldier like my daddy?" she asked David directly. "I was, sweetheart. Your daddy and I probably walked some of the same roads over there." The simple acknowledgement seemed to satisfy Emma, who nodded gravely and called for Thunder. The German shepherd appeared from the courtyard, assessing the visitors with his usual careful attention before focusing on David with particular intensity. What happened next was something Maggie had seen before but never failed to find moving. Thunder approached David slowly, deliberately, until he was close enough to rest his massive head against the veteran's leg. David's composure cracked slightly, his hand automatically moving to scratch behind Thunder's ears in a gesture that spoke of deep familiarity with military working dogs. "He knows," David said quietly. Somehow, he knows. Emma watched the interaction with the wisdom of someone who'd learned that healing often happened in moments of recognition rather than hours of therapy. Thunder lost his soldier friend, too, she said matter-of-factly. That's why he was so sad when we found him. But Grandma Maggie says that helping other people helps us feel better about the people we couldn't save. The profound simplicity of her statement hit David like a physical blow. Here was a 7-year-old girl articulating something he'd been struggling to understand through months of professional counseling, that survival guilt could be transformed into purpose, that honoring the dead meant helping the living. Agent Martinez had stayed for an hour, watching as David and Thunder seemed to communicate in the wordless language of shared trauma. Before leaving, she'd pulled Maggie aside with information that connected yet another piece of their story. "We finally got Thunder's complete military record," she'd said quietly. "His handler was killed in the same operation that took your son. They were working together when the IED went off. Thunder tried to save Michael. That's how he got those scars." The revelation had been overwhelming, but it had also provided a final piece of understanding. Thunder's connection to Emma wasn't just about recognizing trauma, it was about honoring a promise to protect the daughter of the soldier he couldn't save. As the afternoon wound down and their visitors prepared to leave, Emma made an announcement that surprised everyone. "David should come to our program," she told Agent Martinez with the confidence of someone accustomed to making important decisions. Thunder could teach him about being brave when you're scared." David's response was immediate and heartfelt. "I'd like that very much." That evening, as Maggie tucked Emma into bed, her granddaughter asked the question that had been on her mind all day. "Grandma, do you think Daddy would be proud of what we're doing?" Maggie smoothed Emma's dark hair, thinking about Michael's final phone call home, his voice heavy with concern about what would happen to his daughter if he didn't make it back. He'd worried about Blackwood, about Emma's future, about whether love would be enough to protect her from a world that sometimes treated children as objects rather than people. "I think your daddy would be amazed by how brave and kind you've become," Maggie said softly. "And I think he'd be proud that Thunder found a way to keep the promise he couldn't keep himself." Emma nodded, satisfied with the answer, then added sleepily, "Thunder says Daddy's still here sometimes. Not like a ghost, but like love that doesn't go away, even when people do." The insight was profound enough to bring tears to Maggie's eyes, but she managed to keep her voice steady as she kissed Emma goodnight. Outside, Thunder had settled onto his favorite spot on the small patio, positioned where he could see Emma's bedroom window and the entrance to their apartment. Still on guard, still protecting, but no longer consumed by the fear that he might fail again. As Maggie settled into her own bed that night, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. 6 months ago, she'd been a desperate grandmother, willing to do anything to help her traumatized granddaughter. She'd walked into what she'd thought was an animal therapy program, and instead discovered a nightmare of exploitation disguised as research. But sometimes the worst situations revealed the best in people. Emma's healing had inspired dozens of other families to seek help for their own trauma. Thunder's transformation had become a model for rehabilitation programs across the country, and their story had helped expose research practices that might have harmed countless other children and animals. The real miracle wasn't that Emma had found her voice again, or that Thunder had overcome his aggression, or even that they'd defeated Blackwood's attempts to exploit them. The real miracle was simpler and more profound. They'd found each other when they needed each other most, and in healing together, they'd created something stronger than either could have achieved alone. In the end, love had been enough. Not the clinical, measured love of research protocols, but the messy, imperfect, fiercely protective love of a grandmother who'd lost too much to lose anything more. and a little girl who'd learned that silence couldn't protect her, but courage could transform her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more children who needed healing, more animals who deserved second chances, more opportunities to turn their own survival into service for others. But tonight, they were simply a family. Maggie, Emma, and Thunder, safe in their small apartment where love was measured not in research data, but in quiet moments of connection that needed no explanation beyond their own existence. Sometimes that was more than enough. Sometimes it was everything. At 68, Margaret Sullivan discovered that the greatest battles of her life weren't behind her. They were just beginning. When her silent granddaughter Emma finally found her voice through the love of a traumatized German shepherd named Thunder, Maggie learned what so many of us forget in our later years: we still have the power to protect what matters most. This isn't just a story about a child and a dog. It's about recognizing that our experience, our wisdom, and our fierce determination to shield the vulnerable can still change the world. How many times have we been told we're too old, too set in our ways, too tired to fight? Maggie proved that love doesn't diminish with age, it intensifies. When corruption threatened to steal Emma's future, when so-called experts tried to turn a little girl into a research subject, it was Maggie's grandmother instincts and lifetime of nursing experience that saved the day. The truth is, we're not past our prime. We're in our prime for the battles that truly matter. Our grandchildren need our protection, our animals need our advocacy, and our communities need our voice of experience. Sometimes the most important work of our lives happens after everyone else thinks we're done. Questions for reflection. What battles are you still meant to fight in this season of your life? Who in your world needs the protection that only your experience and wisdom can provide? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.